Again, everyone. My name is Matt Fast. I'm the Manager Special Initiatives at ARESA, otherwise known as the Atlantic Region Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies. I would like to start by take a moment to acknowledge that I am currently in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and I'm grateful for the peace and friendship treaties. Most of you today will be joining us from the traditional and unceded territories of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Pescadumagati peoples, as well as the homelands of the Innu and Inuit of Labrador. We recognize the ancestral and continued ties of Indigenous peoples to the lands and waters in the region also known as Atlantic Canada. As the umbrella organization for the settlement and integration sector in the Atlantic region, one of the things we do is provide professional development and informational webinars or presentations for our members. Many of you were on the front lines of the settlement and integration when the government of Canada sought to resettle thousands of Syrian refugees between 2015 and 2016. The Environics Institute for Survey Research conducted a national study to assess the lived experience of Syrian refugees who arrived in Canada between 2015 and 16. The purpose was to document how these refugees have fared in their new country and lives, and what can be learned from their experience that might benefit future refugees. This research involved in-depth interviews with representative sample of 305 Syrian refugees, covering their journey from pre-arrival to present day, as well as their hopes and challenges for their future. The study is intended to provide valuable insight to guide government programs and policies, as well as support the ongoing work of settlement agencies, private sponsor groups, refugee communities, and others involved in refugee settlement in Canada. Now I'm happy to introduce Keith Neuman and Jobran Khanji, who will be presenting this research. Keith Neuman is a senior associate at Environics Institute for Survey Research, where he previously served as the inaugural executive director. Over the past decade, he has directed a number of groundbreaking studies on topics such as immigration and refugees, racism, social capital, reconciliation, and social norms. Jobran Khanji is a community leader, advocate for peace, and researcher with a background in international development and political science. He recently joined Environics Institute for Survey Research to lead the knowledge mobilization efforts for their recent project on the lived experience of Syrian refugees in Canada. Keith and Jobran, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having us as part of this event today, and for doing a nice introduction to our project. And want to welcome all of you who have joined this broadcast. We hope to provide some interesting information and insight. I look forward to your comments and questions at the end. Jobran and I will spend maybe 40 minutes or so presenting the research to you, and then look forward to a little more interaction. Jobran, if you'd like to bring our our deck up. Excuse me. Once it's in share mode, thank you. So this is a research project that we've completed over the past couple of years with Syrian refugees, as Matt has indicated, and we'd like to tell you about it. So next slide, please. What we'll cover in the time that we have is some background about the project to set up the context. Jobran will take you through some of the research findings, and we will end with some conclusions and what we're up to with the project now, before we then open it up to the rest of you. So that's what we'll cover over the next hour and a few minutes. So next slide. Before we get into the research, just to clarify who we are. So we are, as Matt indicated, the Environics Institute for Survey Research. We are a small nonprofit research organization here in Canada. It's been operating for about 15 years or so. And our mandate really is to do relevant social research to help Canada and Canadians understand who we are and where we've come from and where we're going. Through various kinds of projects, focusing on the kind of research other organizations are not doing. We do research on a number of topics. On the slide, you can see the four main themes where we tend to focus our efforts. Canada's diversity, Indigenous peoples and reconciliation, governing Canada, and economic and social change. So that's as much as I will say about who we are, but I will mention that all of our research is public and intended to be used. You can find it all on our website, including the details about this project we're going to tell you about now. Next slide. Let me start out with giving you some background on this project. Next slide. So I think Matt has already given some background on what we're talking about, and those of you today are quite familiar with refugee resettlement in this country. As Matt indicated, starting in 2015, Canada began to take a very large number of refugees from Syria through IRCC programs and different admission streams. So many of them ended up in Atlantic Canada, as you well know. So as you probably also would expect or may know, the federal government certainly sort of did some tracking of the resettlement of refugees through its client surveys. And some other research had been done in the first year or two by some academic researchers across the country and other organizations. But that was not a sustained type of effort to sort of monitor and document the experiences of refugees, this particular cohort of refugees. And I think that was very useful information, but hasn't been sustained. So there are some gaps in our understanding about the experience of resettled Syrian refugees and how they're doing, especially looking at it sort of the broader holistic picture rather than outcomes in specific areas like employment or housing. Next slide. This led to our project. So as Matt indicated, we completed a national study around the lived experience of Syrian refugees. We applied a research approach that we had developed doing similar community studies with other populations in Canada. And we looked to build on the initial research that IRCC and others had done to sort of add to our knowledge and understanding. And this research was made possible through a contribution agreement from IRCC, for which we were very appreciative. Also important to point out that this was an arm's length type of funding in the sense that IRCC provided us with the funds and then left it to us to decide how to do the research, how to analyze and report our results. Next slide. So the basic objectives in broad terms is to understand, document the experiences of Syrian refugees who, by the time we interviewed them, had been in the country for a few years. The goal is to provide some insight and guidance to policy and settlement programming. We also hope this research will help build capacity for further research with with different refugee groups and settlement populations over time. And at a broader level, we hope to expand and perhaps improve upon the general public narrative around refugees living in this country so that Canadians across the country can perhaps better appreciate this experience. Next slide. The project took place over a number of years. We had an initial consultation and design phase to make sure we properly understood the previous work and had consulted with the settlement community and were focusing in the relevant areas. Phase 2 involved the research itself. And phase 3 was the reporting and public outreach across the country, which is a phase we're now involved in and we'll tell you more about at the end. Next slide. Very briefly on the research methods, we did in-depth interviews, one-on-one interviews with a sample of 305 Syrian refugees across the country. We focused on the specific cohort that arrived in fall 2015 through the end of 2016. It was about 40,000 in that particular cohort. These interviews, which lasted an hour or more, were conducted either by telephone or web chat. And we had a mix of quantitative and qualitative questions. The qualitative questions provided participants an opportunity to talk in their own words about their experiences. Excuse me. I should point out that the original plan was to conduct these interviews in person, which is really the most appropriate and effective method for doing this kind of work. However, we were just in the process of launching this research when the COVID-19 pandemic suddenly descended on all of us, and we no longer could proceed with in-person anything at that point. So we had to switch gears. We wanted a sample that was representative of this cohort of refugees, and we established quotas by region, age, gender, admission category, a few other characteristics to make sure that we covered a lot of important bases in this population. From a timing point of view, these interviews were conducted in fall 2020 through spring 2021. Participants did receive an honorarium for their time and participation, as is customary and appropriate for this kind of study. Next slide. This slide, as it fills in, is a bit of a roadmap of the topics that we covered in this research. I'm not going to read them, but you can see that it was quite comprehensive, looking at pre-arrival, early initial settlement period, current life in Canada, and some attention to future outlook as well. Our approach for this research was to be comprehensive and to have breadth with less attention to depth. So we covered many, many areas so that we could look at sort of the holistic picture. But we did not go especially deep into any one of these areas because there was a limit on the scope of what we could cover. So this gives you a sense of what we'll talk about. We will not cover all of these topics today. We don't have the time, but we'll give you a good sense of many of the topics. And we do have more detailed documentation available on our website for further information if you would like to follow up on that. Next slide. So this is a table that just provides an overview of the sample that we interviewed of the 305 refugees. You may not be able to read the numbers, but it provides us a picture of how our sample is distributed across regions of the country, the admission categories, gender, and age. The basic picture is that our sample is pretty representative in all respects. In Atlantic Canada, we completed 29 interviews, which is about 10% of the sample, and a little more than 10%, a little more than the 7% of the actual population. So they are represented. We offered the interview in one of three languages: English, French, or Arabic. Jobran, if you want to hit the next button. Most chose to be interviewed in Arabic. In fact, our interviewers were native Arabic speakers. These interviews really took place in Arabic for most, but some of the results that we'll show you have been translated back into English. Next slide. This is the point at which we'll turn the presentation over to my good colleague Jobran, and he will take you through some of the key findings, and I will come back at the end for some conclusions and lessons learned. Jobran.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of today's session, and I thank Matt and Narisa for organizing this. Before we delve into some of the key research findings of our study, I want just to highlight that it's not that I'm only a member of the Environics Institute team on this research, but I'm also a member of the Syrian newcomer community, which gives me, a closer understanding of the struggles and easier way to bridge the knowledge and the experience with the research work and the results that came out of it. So the order in which we will be sharing our key finding with you today comes in the same arrangement that we asked the participants in the survey. So that was the chronological order of their experience, starting with the initial settlement in Canada. And then, as you've seen in the topics of the study in a couple of slides earlier, then we're going to go into their current settlement experience. So when we say current, it means 2020, 2021, the time when we conducted the interviews. And then at the end, we're going to go into some of their future challenges and goals. So I'm going to start with some of the key findings for the initial settlement experience. So at the beginning, we wanted to know from the participants in what way was Canada similar to what they expected before coming? So this is one of the open-ended questions, and what you see is some of the key themes that came out of their answers. So we can see that there are a number of themes emerging from the results. At the top of the list, we can see that refugees found Canadians to be as caring and friendly and welcoming and helpful as they expected them to be. The second emerging theme was community is safe and secure. Third came the freedom and people have human rights here in this country. The other side of the coin was also to ask them in what way did they find Canada different from what they expected. So on that question, they gave us two different group of answers. Some of the ways in which Canada was different, but positively different from what they expected. And some of the answers were different, but negatively different from what they expected. So reflecting on some of the theme emerging from their answers on negative difference from their expectation, the first thing that came out was they found that finding employment in Canada was far more difficult than they expected. The weather is colder than expected, and the cultural shock. And you can read the rest of the items in the table. And on the other side, they also find Canada to be better than they expected in terms of being more multicultural, open-minded, and religiously tolerant. The second emerging theme was the transition was easier than expected, more freedom of speech, and so on. We also wanted to share with you some of the comments that participants gave us answering the previous two questions. And for the sake of time, I'm just gonna read one of those verbatim quotes. So the one at the bottom given by a female in Newfoundland who arrived in Canada in June 2016. She said, "Healthcare system is lacking, not as expected when you think of a G7 country. Wait times are too long, lack of specialized care, etc. Work is not as easy to find. School registration and acceptance can take a long time, especially when there is a lack of language skills, can be difficult to understand the required steps." We also wanted to know what were the biggest challenges that refugees have faced in their first settlement experience in Canada. And by far, the most common challenge was learning a new language, English in most cases, but also French, where 61% of them reported that language barrier remains to be the #1 challenge in their early settlement experience. Some also mentioned challenges involving the practical necessities or of resettling in a new country, where 15% reported that finding employment is the key challenge, 14% reported finding housing, and figuring out transportation and how to get around. Others talked about challenges in adjusting to an unfamiliar place. 11% reported on cultural shock, and 10% reported on isolation. We also asked participants about the type of support that they found most helpful. in terms of the support services given by the settlement institutions. And the basic necessities, in terms of basic necessities, they reported on finding financial support to be the most helpful type of support. Those are 24% of them. And then language training came next, and the third came accommodation and housing. We also asked them about what type of provider did they find to be the best provider of support and care. Sponsors broadly came first with 12% reporting on them, and then came the newcomer services government and the newcomer services provided by other organizations, and churches, translators, relatives came next. We also wanted to ask about the services that they wanted to have or have more of, but there wasn't much of it, or there wasn't much at all. So we asked them about services that they lacked, and on the top of the list, the most emerging theme was employment support. So they thought that they should be more support in terms of helping them to get relevant and meaningful employment. And the second emerging theme was community level settlement services. The third was accommodation support, and then integration support, financial support, and so on. It's worth noting here on the right, on the table on the right hand, right at the bottom, where 42% of them reported that there's no support, no service support that they are missing. We also wanted to know more about the type of private sponsor for those who were privately sponsored. What was the source of providing this sponsorship? So religious organizations came first with 43% out of the privately sponsored, 62% of the PVOR ones, and then came the group of private individuals, family members, friends, and at the bottom, community organizations. We also wanted to know more about what kind of support did they found to be most helpful. So those are support provided by private sponsors. So on the top of the list came accommodation support. 26% of them reported on that. And then the emotional support given by private sponsors. Financial support came third, transportation support, and then sponsoring a family. We also wanted to know if they are of how important or how essential the service and support they receive from their private sponsor. So this was one of the quantitative answers. So we've given them an option of 3 answers to respond to that. So the question was, how important was the support provided by private sponsors? A majority, 56% of them, reported that the support from private sponsor was essential and they could not have managed without it. Where 24% reported to be very helpful but could have managed without it, and 13% it was somehow helpful but they could have managed without it without difficulty. Apologies. And we also wanted to know if they received what they found to be enough of support from the private sponsors in comparison to less or more. And 71% reported to be receiving the just right amount of support from the private sponsors, where 19% said that they received less than they needed, and 8% they feared that they had too much and were overwhelmed with the kind of support provided by their sponsorship group or agency. Another indicator on the effectiveness and the continuous relationship with their sponsors. So we asked them 5 years or 6 years after their arrival, are they still in contact with their private sponsors? So 73%, the total of across all different streams, said that they still maintain this relationship. And we can see the further details in terms of incoming streams and the source of this private sponsorship: the family and friends with 89%, private individual group with 82%. We also wanted to know more about the which services they received from the government was most helpful to them. So refugees here mentioned a range of helpful government services. At the top came language classes, 27% reported on that, and then health and dental care, 24%, financial support, education support, and housing support. Might be worth reiterating that this was an open-ended question. So refugees identified what they recalled as most meaningful at that time. So this is where we go to the second or the next set of answers and key findings of the study. So this is where we spend the majority of time, the majority of questions, reflecting on how they are coping with their life and how they are faring in their settlement experience at the point of the interviews in 2020 and 2021. So refugees here were asked a general question about how they feel about their overall experience living in Canada at this point in their life. A large majority are positive about their life in Canada, that they have had a chance to get settled. Almost 9 in 10 said that they are either very positive, 48%, or generally positive, 39%. Very few, 2%, are clearly negative in their assessment, and only 1 in 10, so this is the 11% on the top bar, are not clearly positive or negative, or maybe equally both. And the table at the bottom shows that feeling positive about their life was linked to first, their satisfaction with housing, where 64% of them reported to be very satisfied with their current housing status. And the second was the number of close friends, where 67% reported to the sense and linked their sense of satisfaction with having 20 plus friends in their social circles and networks. We wanted to know more about their sense of satisfaction across different aspects and different fronts. So we asked them about their satisfaction on all those aspects that you see in the slide. And the results show that there is a strong satisfaction in some areas and much less so in others. High level of satisfaction were seen in areas such as feeling of safety and security, acceptance of local community, and the integration services given to children in local schools. On the other hand, they were much less likely satisfied with areas such as financial security, where 21% of them only felt satisfied versus 17% were dissatisfied, employment situation, and housing. We also wanted to understand their settlement experience when it comes to generating enough income in their household. So we asked them a question on the which statement of those best describes your total household income at the present time. So, and to make sense of the data generated in this question, we compared that to figures that we have for the Canadian population. So 40% of them reported to be making good enough income through which they can save from it, in comparison to the 37% among the Canadian population, and 63% reported to be making just enough income, but they're not making any savings, which is not quite surprising, taking into consideration that those are newcomers to the country and they're still at a phase where they're building their economic resilience and settlement. And we can see the rest of the figures where 90% they are stretched financially, and 4% they are financially struggling. We also wanted to get a sense of their employment status at the point of time where we interviewed them, and they reported to have half of them employed in some type or sort, where 26% were working full-time, 7% self-employed, 18% working part-time. Again, we're comparing this data with the data we have for the Canadian population, the national data. again, to bring perspective and understanding of what it means. It's worth highlighting here that the figures on unemployment, so this is for the unemployed and looking for work, where 18% of them have reported to be unemployed, versus the Canadian population unemployment of 6%. We also wanted to know if their current employment are close to their education, skills, and experience. And probably this is one of the results that are worth highlighting and need further discussions and care. We're going to reflect more on this in the conclusion slides with Keith. So 21% reported to be that their current employment is very close or are fully close to their education, skills, and experience. 30% reported to be somehow, and 40% they said that their current employment is not close at all to their education, skills, and experience. We also wanted to learn from them about the things that they liked the most about living in Canada. And what stood out most for refugees and what they value about Canada was safety, security, and stability. So this is 44%. So the most prevailing theme. The second 38% came the human rights, and then came the Canadian culture of freedom and acceptance, and then the government and rule of law, and the rest of the item in the table. We also wanted to learn more about the thing that they disliked the most about living in Canada. At the top came the Canadian weather, where 32% of them reported on that, and then the unfamiliar culture and lifestyle, and not being near family and friends. And then the fourth came lack of employment opportunities. It's worth noting the item at the bottom of the table, where 1 in 10, so this is 12%, did not identify anything about Canada that they disliked. So this is one of the broad quantitative questions in which we wanted to have a feel about their overall experience about moving into Canada. So it came with a direct, simple question on looking back. Are you feeling glad that you came to Canada? And we can see that almost all of them, that's 93%, reported yes. And only 1% reported to being not very satisfied about the move. Another key aspect and key challenge of the settlement experience for all groups who are moving into a new country is language. So we wanted to learn more about that through asking them about their level of English and French fluency at the point of their arrival in Canada versus their current fluency in the 4 aspects of proficiency at the point where we interviewed them 5 or 6 years later. So we can see that this was asked in terms of 4 aspects of fluency: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The results showed a clear pattern where most refugees arrived in Canada with limited English or French, as expected, and most made dramatic progress over the next several years. By the time of the interview, most rated their English or French to be excellent or good in all areas of fluency. And refugees who arrived with the least fluency, example, the youngest in the cohort, also made the most significant progress over time. And then we wanted to get a better understanding of their health, that is the physical health and mental health. So we asked them 2 separate questions, and the overall answers in terms of their physical health is very close to the figures that we usually see among the Canadian population, but the numbers were slightly less when it came to mental health, which does not come surprising, reflecting on the harsh environment and the difficult experience that they had before arriving in Canada, fleeing their home and looking for safety in Syria's neighboring country or other countries around the world. We wanted to know more about how stressful their average day is. So we asked them about their sense and their feeling of daily stress in their day-to-day life. And we can see the bar in the middle where almost half of them reported to experiencing a type of stress in their day-to-day life. And then we can see that the more worrying number were 16%, quite a bit stressful, and 14% reported to feeling extremely stressful almost on a daily basis. And then we wanted to know more about their sense of belonging, their sense of connection to Canada. And so we wanted also to make sense of their answers. So we also asked them a separate question about their level and sense of connection to their ethnic and cultural background. So, and we can clearly see that refugees reported to feeling more strongly connected to Canada. That is 55%, in comparison to 29% only reported to have a very strong ties and sense of belonging to their ethnic or cultural background. So this is one of the positive settlement experience data on their sense of belonging to the new home. Another indicator of their sense of belonging and settlement is if they proceeded and continued to apply for their citizenship status in Canada. And at the time of the interviews, almost all the refugees that we interviewed had either became a Canadian citizens, so that are 32%, or those who are in the process and have applied but have not yet acquired the status, so those are 49%. 18% wanted to become Canadians when eligible, and only 1% showed no interest in becoming citizens. Syrian refugees also expressed a strong attachment to their new country. So we asked them the question of how do they think their country is accepting of them. And almost everyone interviewed said they felt that they and their family was made to feel welcome by others in their local community, either very, that's 48%, or generally, that is additional 48%. So another positive data on the success of their settlement experience in this specific aspect. And while Syrian refugees felt accepted in Canada, they are at the time when they're getting established in their community, they still much more that needed to be learned from their experience. So we asked them one of the unusual questions in this kind of public survey, where they asked them, well, what are the things that you wish that Canadians understand better about you and your experience? So the most emerging theme that came out of this open-ended question was the struggles that refugees are facing as newcomers. So this is the 27% of them have reported on that. And they wanted Canadians to know on the impact of civil war that left on them, and that some of them were experiencing trauma and they needed time to heal. Third emerging theme was that not all Syrians are the same. And the fourth came Syrian culture and history. They wanted Canadians to know more about that. So again, this slide's where we share some of the comments and verbatim quotes that they've given us in response to the question in the previous slide. Again, for the sake of time, I'm just gonna pick one of those answers. Maybe the one at the bottom that was given by a male in British Columbia who arrived in January 2016. So his answer was he wanted Canadians to understand that not all the Arab people are the same. They will find the good people and the bad people. So it's not about the culture or the religion. it's the personality. We also wanted to get a sense of their involvement in their local community. So we asked them the questions of, in the past 12 months, have you been actively involved with any of the following organization in your local community? So we wanted to know which of those organizations or institutions were most effective in giving them access and the sense of integration to the local community. On the top of the list, or the most emerging answer, was mosques and churches. 38% of them reported on that. Second came community centers, schools came third, and then recreation center, and the group of organizations of Syrian refugees came at the bottom. We also wanted to get a better understanding of their feeling of being socially settled. So we asked them a couple of questions on the numbers of friends that they have now in Canada. So those are people who are not their direct relatives, but who can feel at ease with, can talk to about what is in their mind, or call for help. And we asked them also a separate questions of how many of these close friends are from Syria. So we can see that almost half of them reported to be having 1 to 5 Canadian friends, and 63% reported to have 1 up to 5 Canadian friends who are Syrians. So those are, again, some of the positive data that reflects and highlight the success of their settlement experience in terms of making friends and feeling socially connected. To further deconstruct and know more about this aspect, we asked them if those friends were outside their household. Those who are outside their household, where in Canada are they residing? So 48% reported to have those friends in their local community or cities, and 41% reported to have those friends elsewhere in Canada. Another aspect of feeling settled in the new home is to know if they are considering to relocate 5 years after arrival, or if they are happy with their current whereabout. So again, a positive data with 71% reported to showing no interest or plans to move anywhere else, in comparison to 20% feeling somewhere, feeling the need or a future plan maybe to move somewhere else in Canada. 3% reported to have plans or thinking about moving even to another country. We wanted to further understand for those who wanted to consider a relocation on the main reason behind their thinking or their decision. So 39% reported that finding employment was the main reason. 24% reported to improving the prospect of their life generally, and 22% reported on personal preferences, and then the lower cost of living, better weather, making a new start, and then other reasons were reported to cover 7% of the reasons. Another aspect of their the changes that they need to adapt to in their new life here in Canada was the changing of their roles within the family, in relevance to the role of their family members that they had before coming to Canada. So 47% reported that they have experienced a type of change in terms of the role inside their families. And we can see that the youngest group, so 18 to 24, were the one who was able to sense and feel this change the most. So those are 65% of this group. And when it comes to gender, women were the group that felt this change the most inside the family. So we came up with a follow-up questions to further understand and deconstruct their answers in the previous slide. So we wanted to ask them, in what way or ways has their role changed within the family in the past 5 years of living in Canada? So for women, 51% reported to have increased responsibility generally versus 33% among men. More parenting and caregiving responsibilities came next, and the third came more financial responsibilities. We also wanted to have a better understanding of their sense of settlement when it comes to families and children, and so the question was how well would they say their children have adapted to life in Canada or feeling accepted by others in school. So 2/3 of the refugees interviewed have children living in Canada, mostly in household with 3 or more people, but in some cases, including a single parent and a child. Most of these children were born prior to coming to Canada, and the study asked parents how their children were doing in terms of adapting to life in schools and being accepted at schools. And most parents believe that their children are doing very well, both in adapting to live in Canada, so that are 68%, and being accepted in their local schools, 71%. And very few, 1 to 2%, reported that this is not going well. So this is where we move to the last section of key findings in the study, and the last section that came in the survey that we shared with them. So this is in reflection to the goals, aspirations, and challenges for their future life. To further know more about their future outlooks, we asked them, looking ahead, to identify what 3 things they most want to achieve in their lifetime. So this is one of the open-ended question. The list of themes emerging in their answers was extensive and resembled to what we might expect to see from any group of Canadians at some point. So on the top of the list came owning their own home. So 42% of them reported on that theme. And to complete their education came next with 39%. And other main theme that emerged in their answers was around work and career, family and children, and financial security. We also asked them if they felt optimistic about achieving those goals, or at least some of those goals. So in this slide, we show the results for the entire group and also by age cohort. So overall, more than 9 in 10 are somewhat 47%, if not very 45% optimistic achieving their life goals. And again, it's the youngest group, so those are 18 to 24 at the time of the interview, who are the most confident in terms of being very optimistic. Very few, almost in any age group, reported to have low optimism. We also wanted to know of what they see as the biggest challenges facing them to achieve those goals for the future. So financial challenges came first with 24%, and then poor language skills, finding work, and the impact that COVID left on them and the delays that emerged out of that, poor health, and the responsibilities, government bureaucracy came next. So this is where I hand it over back to Keith so he can share with you some of the conclusions and overall reflections that came out of the study, and to share some further data on the Atlantic provinces. Keith, I hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Jobran. You've covered quite a lot of ground, and let me try and pull things together a bit with some final thoughts. Next slide. So, there was so much that was covered, and we didn't even talk about all of it, but let me just give you a few broad points. I think that at an overall level, it's quite clear from the research that this cohort of refugees were notably successful in terms of managing to resettle in Canada and establish new lives for themselves and their family. It's not that everyone thrived in all respects, but when you look across all of the data, there's much more positive than negative in most of the areas that we've seen. I think one of the surprises, perhaps, that we found in the research is that these positive outcomes, and again, we're looking primarily at the current lives, how they were doing when we interviewed them, that the positive outcomes were notably similar across this cohort, despite the diverse backgrounds, the circumstances in which they came, and where they lived, and so forth, and even across the different admission categories, private and government sponsored. There were some particular challenges with government sponsored refugees early on, but by the time that we interviewed them, those differences had largely disappeared. So I think this is a pretty notable finding, and suggests something about the progression of resettlement. I think if we were to identify any particular group of refugees from this cohort that were still likely to struggle 5 or 6 years in the country, it is the pretty small proportion who continue to be financially stressed, the ones that simply are struggling financially. Again, it's a small group, but that group also has much less positive outcomes in other areas. And then finally, I think of all the sort of the areas and aspects of life that we looked at, employment and underemployment was and continues to be the most significant challenge facing refugees from Syria. It comes out fairly clearly in our data. I think this may also reflect the experiences of other refugee groups and other newcomers, as many of you would be aware, but comes out very clearly in this study as the one area that has posed the greatest challenge. Next slide. So we realize that all of you are in Atlantic Canada and are very interested perhaps in the results for your region. I think the first thing to say is that about, as I'd said at the beginning, about 10% of our sample were in Atlantic Canada, 29 interviews out of 305. And that really doesn't give us quite a large enough sample to be conclusive in terms of what we could say about the Syrian refugee experience in Atlantic Canada. So we have to be fairly careful in what we say and not overstating it. But that being said, going to offer you some perspective on this. And I guess I would describe these sort of findings as directional. And not to put too much emphasis on the significance of them, but nevertheless, I think it is useful to share this with you. I think the profile of refugees in Atlantic Canada compared to other parts of the country, a little more likely to be represented by those in the government-sponsored stream, a little more likely to have larger families and to have somewhat less education income upon arrival. And that continued through. Again, this is not all or nothing, but I think that those were the aspects that perhaps distinguish the refugees in Atlantic Canada that we interviewed. Early on in the initial settlement period, housing was a bit more likely to be a challenge, mentioned in your region than elsewhere. So that stands out a bit. In terms of current lives, when we interviewed them, I think compared to elsewhere in the country, refugees in Atlantic Canada were a little more positive about financial security, their local schools, feel welcomed by other Canadians, a little more likely to say they knew their neighbors and had extended family nearby. Mental health was a bit stronger than elsewhere, and certainly optimistic about achieving life goals. So these were areas where the Atlantic Canadian results were a bit more positive. Next slide. On the less positive side, refugees in Atlantic Canada were a little less satisfied in terms of safety and security. and also a little more likely to talk about discrimination that they experienced in Canada due to their ethnicity, culture, or religion. Again, I don't want to overstate these differences and variations, but consider them to be, I guess, directional, if that's the best word to use. Next slide. So some lessons, I think, just to reflect on the research from what we've seen. As we have gone around the country over the past several months presenting these findings to settlement groups and others, I think one of the messages we heard back very clearly is that the results in this research have largely confirmed their own experiences and perspectives with Syrian refugees from this cohort. In other words, we seem to be validating the experience on the ground that some of you and others across the country have seen in working with this population. So I think in some ways, not much in the way of surprises, but also perhaps validating and providing some research to help reinforce, I think, some of the lessons that you've already been learning. So I think that's I think useful to point out. I'd be interested in your comments on that as well. Some of the areas that clearly suggest that greater attention is needed in terms of resettlement support. Clearly, employment stands out as one that's pretty critical, and that's probably not news to you. Providing more pre-arrival information. We didn't spend much time on this area today, but this is an area that I think would be helpful in terms of managing expectations, helping refugees prepare when they arrive. So clearly areas that could be given more attention. One of the other things we've heard as we've presented across the country about the experiences of this cohort of Syrian refugees is the success that they have experienced is due in large part to the unprecedented mobilization of leadership and citizens that took place starting in 2015 to sort of come to the table, so to speak, and to extend themselves in terms of making Canada a welcoming place and addressing the needs of refugees who are arriving. I think many of you have probably been involved in that, continue to be involved in that. Clearly, the level of mobilization was very significant in every part of the country, and that has made a big difference in terms of how these refugees have been doing. So in the end, it demonstrates, I think, what's possible to do in terms of ensuring success with refugee resettlement, but also indicates what perhaps is necessary for this to continue. And I think one of the other things that we've learned as we've gone across the country is that maintaining this level of support and mobilization has been extremely difficult to achieve due to burnout and the pandemic and all kinds of other factors. And it presents a challenge in terms of not only maintaining, but also addressing gaps that still occur. So while we've seen a lot of success in terms of resettlement of this particular cohort, this is not something that we can conclude for other refugee cohorts who have come afterwards, and this remains to be addressed. Next slide. So to finish up very briefly, next slide, Jobran, we just want to talk a bit about what we've been up to, if you could just put it all on the screen. So since January, after we released the results publicly, we have been, as we've indicated, meeting with settlement agencies and groups and doing presentations and media interviews to share the results of this research and to bring it to your attention, to engage with you on it, to sort of encourage people in the settlement community and governments and so forth to think about what the results mean and what should come out of it. We're a research institute. We are not a policy organization. We're not an advocacy organization or settlement organization. So our job was to produce the research and to make it available and to bring it to people's attention. It's not our role to provide specific recommendations but through this outreach process, we're hoping to engage with those who can make the recommendations, who can make a difference, and identify the important steps to go next. So again, this is just a relatively brief presentation, but there's a lot of supporting material behind it, which we encourage you to check out. We have a very detailed final report on our website, along with data tables, which provide the results to all the questions by region and demographic group and admission category and so forth. We have also produced a separate report, a very brief overview of the research that's 10 pages that is intended for people who don't want to read a research report. They just want to get a general idea of what we've covered. And this overview is available in both English and Arabic. And finally, we are in the process of developing a video story of the research, which we think will be another effective way to convey the messages. We've done this with some of our other community studies, and the next month or two, this will be available also on our website, and encourage you to check it out and make use of it. So finally, if you do want more information about this research, we're happy to chat with you. Jobran, my colleague, and myself, you can find us, our email addresses and so forth. Next slide. So we be happy to provide more information. This is the point at which we will stop talking, and we will turn it back to Matt, and we look forward to your comments and questions. So Matt, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for that very informative presentation. Yeah, we're going to just open the floor up to some questions now. If folks have questions, you can either raise your hand or put them in the chat box, and we'll make sure they get heard. I see, is it Saya or Saja? You have your hand up. You can go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Saja Al-Zobi. So thank you, Matt, for this. And thank you, Keith and Jobran, for this insightful and fruitful, actually, presentation. I'm so happy to be here with you today to listen to it. So I'm Saja Al-Zobi. I'm a lecturer in development studies and political science in St. Mary's University, and I have been here in Canada for 1 year. I came from England. So, and my field actually is gender and forced migration, and I work with refugees in general, but in particular with Syrian refugees, as I'm a Syrian. Originally, I'm a Syrian. So this is, and I'm really interested in conducting this relative or similar research in Canada. So this is really helpful for me. So I have some, maybe some inquiries, some comments, some insights. Just please bear with me because I need to learn more. And I would really appreciate if I can get the report, the whole report or the presentation, just if we can stay in touch because I need to know more about this actually to enrich my research in Canada.
That's great, Saja. I would suggest you start with the full report that's on our website and have a look at that, and then feel free to follow up with further questions. We'd be happy to talk to you more.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. Yes, I got it in that chat. Thank you, Jobran. Good. So, so first of all, I just need to know, I'm socioeconomic, so I'm economist actually, and I just to enrich my my background about this research, I just to know who is the unit of this sample. Is it single people? Is it the single person? Or it's household health? This is one thing. The other thing that I'm not sure, maybe you mentioned some issues, but I've missed it. So you mentioned that the quality of life was good, 11% fine, that it's good, and 4% was worse than what I have expected. I just I want to be sure if this is correct or I missed something, because I wanted to know, as socioeconomic, so I wanted to know more what's beyond this. In terms of emotional and integrational needs. This is, I think, maybe it's more interpreted or explained in the report, so I will check this in the report. For those who mentioned, 42% mentioned that there's no support when they arrived. Did they need this support and they didn't get it? So this is actually, it's very important issues. So just to know beyond this, what is the reason behind this and why they didn't get it? And then maybe we can include this in our, or involve this in the policies.
Why don't we start? Why don't we answer those, and then we can move on to other questions? But
Yep.
That's a few. I think just very quickly, the unit of analysis is we interviewed, we sampled people from different size households. So many had families, some were single, and so forth. We only interviewed one individual per household. So we were focused on that individual. We did not interview an entire household, but some of the questions related to the household rather than the individual. So I hope that answers that question. And then your last question about government, about supports that were needed. Just to clarify, that was a question that we asked people if when they first arrived, there were any supports they wished they'd had that they didn't get. That was the question. And 42% said that there was nothing lacking, that there were no supports that they missed, I guess, or wished they'd had that they didn't. So just to be clear on the results on that question. I hope that helps. The details are in our report.
Oh, thank you. This is really helpful. Thank you. So,
Okay.
So I think, Saja, if it's okay, we'll move to the next
Right.
person with the question, and then if there's
Yeah.
time, then you can come back and ask more questions. Is that okay, Sarja?
okay, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go Zara, Arya, and then Carolyn. So Zara, go ahead.
Yes. Hello, hi, Jobran and Keith. Thank you so much. It's really a very rich research. We're very happy to take part in this discussion and to listen to all these findings. I had the question. So most of the data that you have shared was not disaggregated in terms of gender, group, sexual orientation, age group, people with disabilities. Do you have this in the data in the tables? And why did we just see this kind of disaggregation when talking about the change in the family? When you talked about how women perceived it and how men perceived it, but we didn't see it in other slides in your presentation. Also, my other question was related to the satisfaction and the expectations and the goals. Are they compared to their previous also context and life back home or back in the neighbor countries? Was this also a question? So how are you satisfied now in comparison to where were you, or was it just related to Canada specifically?
Well, I'll take those in reverse order. I'll answer the second question first. That question was really focused on their life in Canada going forward. In other words, asking them about their life forward from the point at which we were interviewing them. So we did not frame that question in the context of their previous lives. Would have been interesting. And just answering your first question. So yes, in this presentation, most of the results were the aggregated total for the entire sample. That's partly because we didn't have time today to get into all those details. And so we really had to provide a general picture of this population and how they're doing. That being said, there are a lot of similarities across groups. In many cases, more similarities than differences. But the data tables, which are on our website, do provide the disaggregated results. by gender, by age, by religion, by many factors. So I think if you are interested in seeing how the results of various questions and topics compare across groups, you will find that in those tables. And I think the only other comment to make is because a sample of 300 is very good for a national picture, but as you go down into smaller and smaller groups, I guess the precision and maybe the validity of the results isn't quite as strong, simply because the sample sizes start getting smaller and smaller. So we have to be more careful about drawing strong conclusions from small sample sizes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Over to Arya.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation, Keith and Jobran. Nice to meet you both. So I'll introduce myself. So I'm Arya. I work with Arisa now as a project co-lead. I have been, I worked as a settlement worker for 5 years, since the beginning of the Syrian revolution in 2015. I have worked closely with the Syrian refugees from all religions. And I think the findings that you brought up today are very useful. But I have similar concerns to Zahra. The data you provided consisted of 2 genders, men and women. I was wondering if you took into account non-binary individuals. Was that an option that was given to participants, or was it just men and women? We have to be careful about these things because Canada receives many refugee seekers, asylum seekers rather, from Syria that I worked with. In the last 2 years before working with Arisa, I worked closely with gay, trans people from Syria, and their experiences are drastically different from the cis straight Syrian refugee population. They face incredibly higher levels of stress. Do they have access to churches and mosques? Yes, they have. Do they want to go? They definitely don't want to go to those places because they feel extremely unsafe. And a lot of them have been ostracized by their families and by their religious communities. So we really have to apply an intersectional lens and maybe try to be more inclusive when we give this information. So also, a lot of them face not only ostracization from their communities, but also higher levels of unemployment, drug and alcohol addiction, because of the level of discrimination and hatred they face. They don't only face racism and xenophobia, they also face lack of employment because people sometimes don't want to employ them because they're visible. And they have a very, very hard time finding housing. They have way higher levels of mental health struggles because of the level of hostility that Canadian society has. A lot of them come here, they think Canada is very rosy, it's perfect, it's utopia, it's a utopian country. It's not. There are a lot of challenges that we could dismantle and help their settlement and focus on their mental well-being. So maybe my comments, they're really not questions, but maybe my comments will inform us all to apply those lenses in the future. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just make a brief comment, Jobran. You may want to add as well. When we asked about gender, the question was framed so that people had other choices. But very few, if any, opted to identify other than male or female. And of course, as you can imagine, some people may feel that they have to make one of those choices. So I don't know that we had representation of non-binary individuals in our sample, and we certainly couldn't select for that. So I expect that we didn't capture that experience that part of the population especially well. We did ask some questions about experiences of discrimination that we didn't have a chance to present today because of time. But we did ask some questions. We did capture some experience, and some reported experiencing discrimination because of gender. So I think maybe there's a bit of what you're talking about in our data, but it's a challenging thing to capture in this kind of research. But you raise, I think, some good points. So Jobran, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, thank you, Arya, for highlighting this. I do agree that, more attention, more care, a more sectional lens needs to be applied to order to capture the experience of this group of the community. I do agree, and I also think that because of the exceptional challenges that this specific group are facing, maybe even a designated research can be done on this, not only for LGBT community and non-binary people coming from Syria, but from other asylum seekers from around the world. I do know firsthand the challenges of those people. They are far more the challenges that than we have shared with you in today's presentation. So thank you for highlighting this area.
Thank you, Arya. We'll go to Carolyn.
Hi there. Yeah, I just thank you so much. I mean, I think it's really interesting that the breadth of questions that are there, the data, it really points to some interesting things. What I'm curious about is just what in your opinion would be the availability of comparative data which could help inform longer term study of all refugee populations. Since the Syrian cohort, we now have seen Afghanistan and Ukraine. And I think these are populations that are obviously getting a lot of focus and attention. But what are some of those hopeful comparative data sets, or the lack thereof, in order to really compare these populations to see that we're serving all refugee populations as best we can?
Well, Carol, that's a good question. So this research project, by sort of definition and necessity, focused on this particular cohort. I mean, it was an important cohort, I guess. And I think, as you said, we've covered a lot of ground with it. But as I said previously, we cannot simply apply these results to other cohorts or other refugees or newcomers. And there isn't comparative research. There's not comparative research at this point. I think, as you suggest, that would be extremely valuable. I think that part of our vision of doing this research is to perhaps provide the foundation and maybe some impetus for further research to be done with other refugee groups, whether we're involved or not. And we're hoping that perhaps it will provide a model and some ideas and interest in repeating this kind of research with other groups, so that there are comparisons. At this point, it doesn't exist.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. Anyone else have any further questions? Saja, did you still have some that you wanted to ask?
Thank you, Matt. I'm sorry, I have actually more than 20 points, so I will bear this after reading the report. I just wanted to highlight one issue that it's already mentioned by colleagues as well, but about gender roles. When you mentioned about the changes in family members' roles between women and men, that means there's gender roles change, and there is a change in gender norms as well. So I just wanted to know if this is men were happy with this, or it's something have been imposed on them that to adapt to the new situation in Canada. And actually the final result, I think that it's dignity and respect and welcoming is very, it's really a privilege for the Syrian refugees in Canada. And this is the reason maybe why it's only 6%, it's almost 20% among your sample who are suffering mental health. It's still alarming percentage, but actually it's lower than many others in other contexts or in other countries. And one final point I wanted to highlight for now, it's about because I know during these programs, there's a long waiting time for those people to come to Canada. So I suggest maybe it would worth, or it would help if you of those refugees can be rehabilitated or prepared for living in Canada during their life, during their accommodation in their country before arriving in Canada. For example, learning English language before they arrive Canada. Maybe this will help. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to contact you, Keith and Jobran and Matt, for further discussion. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for your interest.
You're on mute, Matt.
Matt, you're muted.
Sorry, you think I'd learn after all this time? I'm just saying, if anybody else would like to ask a final question before we move on to the next thing here. No? All right. Well, I just want to thank Jobran and Keith for putting this together for us today. It was very informative and very interesting. And as they've said, for more information, I believe Jobran put the link to the report in the chat as along with their email addresses and stuff. So we want to thank you for coming today. But before you folks go, Melanie is just going to pop 2 polling questions on the screen that will be anonymous when you answer them. And it's just to help us as an organization get some feedback from folks who attend these presentations or webinars to know that we are providing you with the right type of information that you want and the right type of presentations and that type of thing for the future. So I don't know if Melanie's ready to put that on the screen or not, but the answers will be anonymous and take a few seconds to answer those before you leave. But other than that, yeah, I just want to say a big thank you to both of you for taking your time to do this, and we very much appreciate it. And otherwise, folks, I hope everyone has a great day.
Well, listen, thanks for having us on your show.
On our show, yeah.
Take care.
The weekly show, yeah.
Yeah.